Alright, this is the first episode of my Wuthering Heights Reader's Guide series. In this video, I'm going to be covering some autobiographical information surrounding Emily Bronté's life, and I'm going to be giving an in-depth summary of Wuthering Heights. Then, in the remaining episodes, I'm going to be covering different aspects of the book. In the first part of the series, we're going to be focusing on some of the main themes of the book, and then in the second part of the series, I'm going to focus on looking at some of the main characters in the book. Part 1. The Life of Emily Bronté. Emily Bronté was born on the 30th of July 1818 to Maria Branwell and Patrick Bronté in Thornton in Yorkshire, Northern England. Emily's early life was full of lots of tragedy. She lost her mother at a young age, and then she lost two of her siblings as well due to the unsanitary conditions of a school that they all went to. In fact, the school and the deaths of these siblings were partially what inspired Charlotte Brontë in her novel Jane Eyre, where Jane goes to a similar sort of school which is very unsanitary and leads to the deaths of characters. So Emily's life was a life that was full of constant death. And this unpredictability of death and its being around constantly is reflected in Wuthering Heights. In fact, most of the characters in Wuthering Heights die, and oftentimes these deaths just come out of nowhere. In some cases, characters die so quickly that you barely even notice that they've died. For example, Edgar Linton's parents die in the span of a sentence. Now, I think all of this people catching sudden deaths seems kind of weird to modern readers, but thinking about this in the context of Emily's life, it really wasn't all that insane for her to imagine that all of these characters are going to die randomly, because death was just so prevalent back then. Of the Brontë sisters, Emily is probably the one that we know the least about. One thing that we do know though is that she was definitely the shyest. While she did take up a lot of work as a governess, she really didn't enjoy it and she often missed home. She really didn't seem to like the restrictive lifestyle of being a governess, and she really wanted to be at home on the moors where she felt her most free. As Charlotte Brontë herself would later write, "Liberty was the breath of Emily's nostrils. Without it, she perished." The change from her own home to a school, and from her own very noiseless, very secluded, but unrestricted and inartificial mode of life, to one disciplined through routine, was what she failed in enduring. I felt that she would die if she did not go home, and with this conviction, obtained her recall. Now this is a very interesting piece of information, because as we'll see as we get into Wuthering Heights, characters like Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff are attached to the moors in a very similar way to the way in which Emily was attached to the moors. As I said, there isn't that much known about Emily's personality and the things that she did, but Charlotte, her sister, does comment on a few things about Emily's behaviour that are quite interesting when thinking about Wuthering Heights, the novel. She was known to be deeply devoted to her family and the moors and her dogs, and while she did have a certain degree of homeliness, she wasn't above taking care of her dad and her family, she also did have quite the temper and was even quite masculine in her character. In a biographical note that Charlotte made after Emily's death, she said, "In Emily's nature, the extremes of vigour and simplicity seemed to meet. Under an unsophisticated culture, inartificial tastes, and an unpretending nature, lay a secret power and fire that might have informed the brain and kindled the veins of a hero. But she had no worldly wisdom. Her powers were unadopted to the business of life. She would fail to defend her most manifest rights, to consult her most legitimate advantage. An interpreter always ought to have stood between her and the world. Her will was not very flexible, and it generally opposed her interest. Her temper was magnanimous, but warm and sudden, her spirit altogether unbending." This more stubborn, aggressive side of Emily's personality was also picked up on by one of Emily's teachers. She should have been a man, a great navigator. Her powerful reason would have deduced new spheres of discovery from the knowledge of the old, and her strong, imperious will would never have been daunted by opposition or difficulty, never have given away but with life. She had a head for logic, and a capability of argument unusual in a man and rarer indeed in a woman. Impairing this gift was her stubborn tenacity of will, which rendered her obtuse to all reasoning where her own wishes or her own sense of right was concerned. What's interesting about these comments about Emily's personality is they are very much reflected in characters in Wuthering Heights, especially characters like Heathcliff and Catherine. Catherine herself is a character who is torn between these two sides, this more civilised, polite side, and this wild, aggressive and masculine side. And it's interesting to see how these psychological dilemmas, at least based on some evidence, are reflected in Emily herself. Another thing about Emily that is reflected in Wuthering Heights is her love of nature. The moors in Wuthering Heights are more than just a setting. They are a character in their own right, and they even seem to have influences on the story and the character. I'm reminded here of Katherines' death scene where she's begging Nellie to open the window because she needs to feel the cold breeze just hitting her in the face because she believes that that's going to bring her back to life. Emily's attraction to nature, though, is particularly interesting because unlike a lot of poets or writers who tend to enjoy nature, they often tend to focus on nature as this beautiful, pretty thing that's really nice and kind of submissive to human beings. Whereas Emily doesn't do that. She appreciates the beauty of nature, but she also sees the dark side of nature, and that's something that really comes out in Wuthering Heights. Nature has the power to give life and to keep you warm and safe, but it also has the power to take that life away, and it will do whichever one it wants, whenever it wants. And Emily really understands this. In terms of Emily's creative output, there isn't that much of it. Wuthering Heights was her only novel, and in terms of her published work, at the time of her death, there was only an anthology of poetry, which was some of her poems and some of her sister's poems. But after her death, we did get more of her poetry, although certainly not all of it, and we also didn't get any of the prose that she worked on. Emily's poetry, though, is usually regarded as some of the best poetry, certainly better than her sister's, and for some people, her poems are even better than the novels of her and her sisters too. And I can certainly see that, and there are definitely connections between Emily's poetry and Wuthering Heights, and I would definitely recommend checking out her poetry because it's definitely worth a read, and it's also pretty direct poetry. It's not hard to read, so if you struggle with, more symbolic or vague poetry, I think you'll find a lot to enjoy in Emily's poetry. When it was released, Wuthering Heights received mixed reviews. Critics enjoyed the imagination and the language of the story, but they really did not like the characters, who they saw as violent, disgusting, horrible people with nothing sympathetic about them. What's interesting about this reception is that it also seems to have carried through to the modern day. A lot of people don't like Wuthering Heights because they find the characters just too savage and crazy. That being said, Wuthering Heights, even if people do have gripes about the characters, is certainly regarded as a classic now, and it probably wasn't back then. Tragically though, Emily would die just a year after publishing Wuthering Heights, and she would never really know how successful the novel was to become. Part 2, a summary. Wuthering Heights begins in 1801. A young man from the city called Lockwood has recently taken up residency in a place called Thrushcross Grange, which is a place isolated in the Yorkshire Moors. While he's settling in, he decides to pay a visit to his landlord, Heathcliff, who lives at Wuthering Heights, which is a farmhouse just a few miles away. Lockwood is surprised when he gets to the house because in comparison to Thrushcross Grange, Wuthering Heights is a bit shabby. At the Heights, he meets a few characters. A cold young woman, who will later be revealed to be Katherines Linton, a young servant who seems to have very high opinions of himself, Hareton, and a cantankerous old man called Joseph. Lockwood spends a very interesting time at this house. In the course of just a night, he finds himself insulted by pretty much everyone in the house. He witnesses domestic violence, he gets attacked by dogs, and when he tries to go to sleep, he possibly witnesses a ghost who claims to be Katherines Linton, who has been lost on the moors for 20 years. After this bizarre and crazy experience, Lockwood, either from shock or the cold weather, becomes ill. While recuperating from his illness, he gets talking to Nellie Dean, who is his housekeeper, and who reveals herself to be the previous housekeeper of Wuthering Heights. Nellie agrees to tell Lockwood all about Heathcliff and the people in that very strange house. The story now jumps back 30 years. Wuthering Heights is now home to the Earnshaw family, and they're a nice couple, but a bit shabby, a bit rough and ready. And they have two children, Catherine Earnshaw and Hindley. Catherine Earnshaw is the mother of Katherines Linton, who we introduced earlier. One day, Mr. Earnshaw takes a trip to Liverpool, and when he comes back from Liverpool, he has Heathcliff with him. Catherine and Heathcliff strike up a great friendship. Heathcliff is also favourited by Mr. Earnshaw, but he is despised by his wife, and especially by Hindley, who often bullies and beats Heathcliff. Soon after this, Mrs. Earnshaw is the first of many, many characters to die, and Mr. Earnshaw sends Hindley off to university because he can't be bothered with all this drama anymore. Then, 3 years later, we have our second death with Mr. Earnshaw, and Hindley returns to Wuthering Heights, now its master, with his wife, Frances. Now that he's in charge, Hindley starts to get his revenge on Heathcliff, and one of the things that he does to do this is to make Heathcliff into a servant. Heathcliff doesn't seem to mind this so much, he gets on with it, and him and Catherine still seem to enjoy their friendship, but everything starts to change when one day they run out onto the moors at night and they come across Thrushcross Grange, where they meet Edgar and Isabella Linton. The Lintons are kind of the opposite of the Earnshaws, very well to do, they live in a grange which is a nice grand house in the country. While they're at the grange, they get attacked by dogs, And the outcome of this is that Katherine stays behind at the Grange for a few weeks while Heathcliff returns to Wuthering Heights. And when Katherine comes back, she has changed quite a bit. Katherine gets a taste for the finer things in life. She gets nice clothes, she gets probably the first bath she's had in years, and she gets a bit of love and care from the Linton family. And so when she comes back to Wuthering Heights and she sees the grubby Heathcliff, she kind of finds that a little bit funny, and so does everyone else. Katherine, Hindley and Edgar Linton himself all make fun of Heathcliff for how uncouth he is, and this begins a love triangle and also a dilemma for Katherine as she gets caught between these two forces, the civilised Lintons and the rugged and wild Heathcliff. Heathcliff naturally gets angry at being bullied by all these people, and his response to that is to throw boiling applesauce into Edgar's face, and Hindley's response to that is to lock him up in his bedroom. It's at this point when Heathcliff vows his first revenge on Hindley, and where his character starts to take a real darker turn. A few days pass, and yet again another character has died. This time Frances is the one to go. She dies of consumption just a few days after giving birth to her son, Hareton. Hindley then becomes a drunken mess for the rest of the novel and is pretty abusive to his son Hareton, who is only really loved by Nellie Dean herself, who acts as a guardian and often protects Hareton from Hindley and his crazy abuse. Katherine starts to become detached from Heathcliff. She's spending more and more time with Linton now, she's becoming more educated, and Heathcliff is just a farmhand basically who hasn't been taught anything. Everything comes to a head one day when Heathcliff decides that he wants to take our day off work, because Hindley's away so he can get away with a bit of skiving. He goes to Katherine, he says, "Do you want to hang out?" And she says nope, she doesn't want to, and she insults him for basically being boring and low class, and she doesn't want anything to do with him anymore. Heathcliff naturally gets quite upset about this. Katherine feels guilty about it, but before she can do anything about it, Edgar Linton arrives at the house, and Katherine, in typical style, takes her anger out on Edgar and also Nellie by slapping both of them across the face. Now, despite the domestic violence there, Edgar still decides on this very day to ask Katherine to marry him, and she accepts. After she accepts the proposal, Katherine asks Nellie for advice. She basically wants to know if she made the right decision in choosing Edgar when she really does seem to prefer Heathcliff, deep down at least. While they're having this conversation, Katherine mentions that it would degrade her to marry Heathcliff because of his low status, and Heathcliff overhears this part of the conversation, but not the rest of the conversation, because then he wouldn't run away like he does. Heathcliff at this point vanishes from the story for a while, and Katherine, reacting to Heathcliff's disappearance, has her first really crazy episode, which leaves her sick for several days, and her doctor warns Edgar Linton not to test his wife's temper again. And while Katherine is ill, she gives her illness to Edgar's parents, and both of those two die within pretty much a sentence of us learning that they're even ill. Things seem to calm down a bit after this. Katherine and Edgar get married, and despite Nellie complaining that Katherine is a bit haughty as a mistress of the house, and noting that Edgar might be a little bit scared of Katherine, things seem to go pretty well until Heathcliff returns several years later. Except now, Heathcliff himself has become at least a little bit civilised, and he's got a lot of money, although no one really knows where this money comes from. Some people speculate that he might have been involved in the slave trade. Some people speculate that he might have, I don't know, run a business. Who knows? It's a mystery. But Heathcliff and Katherine return to their relationship. They start seeing each other again. Heathcliff himself decides to move back into Wuthering Heights, and it's later revealed that Heathcliff is slowly taking away Hindley's property in Wuthering Heights by having him gamble it all the way to Heathcliff. But Heathcliff's plot doesn't stop there. He also starts to seduce Isabella Linton. When Edgar finds out what Heathcliff is up to, he warns Isabella to stay away from Heathcliff, telling her that she'll be disowned if she ever decides to marry him. He then, for the first time in the novel, grows a backbone and tells Katherine that she will no longer be able to see Heathcliff. True to form, Katherine goes into her second meltdown and ends up bedridden for several days, while Edgar locks himself away in his study. While Katherine is locking herself up and falling ill, Isabella retains her contact with Heathcliff, and she runs away from Thrushcross Grange to marry Heathcliff. When Edgar finds out, true to his word, he decides that he doesn't want anything to do with Isabella ever again. Isabella will later send Nellie a letter telling her how horrible it is being married to Heathcliff, who is abusive, horrible and evil, and she'll plead her brother for help, but because he's a bit of an arse, he doesn't bother doing that. When Heathcliff learns that Katherine is seriously ill, he begs Nellie to let him see her and basically threatens to go in there with guns if she doesn't, and so of course she lets him see Catherine. The two of them meet, and Catherine seems to have a moment where she comes back to herself, at least for a moment, but Catherine and Heathcliff are once again torn apart when Edgar comes back to the house, and after this event, Heathcliff leaves, Catherine falls into labour, gives birth to her daughter, Catherine Linton, and then she dies. When Heathcliff learns about Katherine's death, he summons Catherine's ghost, at least he calls upon it, and begs it to haunt him for the rest of his life. Soon after all of this tragedy, Isabella turns up one stormy night at Thrushcross Grange, and she tells Nellie that she has escaped from Heathcliff. She managed to escape by inducing a fight between Hindley and Heathcliff, and she just took that as an opportunity to just get out of there, and at this point she manages to escape the world of Wuthering Heights, going to a city, and she gives birth to her and Heathcliff's son, Linton. But sadly for Isabella, she will die 12 years later, because it's Wuthering Heights and everyone dies. 6 months after Isabella's escape, Hindley also dies, and the circumstances around his death seem a little bit suspicious, and some speculate that Heathcliff actually may have finished Hindley off. With Hindley dead, Heathcliff is now the owner of Wuthering Heights, and he takes revenge on Hindley by making his son Hareton a servant, just as Hindley made Heathcliff a servant. Meanwhile, Edgar Linton raises his daughter Cathy, and he basically keeps everything about Wuthering Heights a complete secret. Edgar's plan to keep Cathy safe from all of this stuff, though, falls apart when Isabella dies, and she gets in touch with Edgar and tells him that she wants him to look after her son Linton, because naturally she doesn't want her son to go live with Heathcliff. While Edgar is away getting Linton, Cathy finally gets liberated. She escapes from Thrushcross Grange to explore the moors, and of course she ends up going to Wuthering Heights. While she's there, she meets Hareton, and she accidentally lets it slip that her young cousin Linton is coming to stay with her and her uncle, and of course Hareton tells Heathcliff that this is happening, and Heathcliff, when he finds out, demands that Linton live with him, as after all he is his son. Edgar, because again he's an arse, doesn't bother challenging this. He lets Linton go. Linton goes to live with Heathcliff, where he undoubtedly will suffer loads of abuse at Heathcliff's hand. Although they're separated from each other though, Cathy and Linton keep up a correspondence through letters and start to develop a romance. Nellie finds out about this though, and she quickly puts a stop to it, and Heathcliff, because he's manipulative, tells Linton that Cathy did this because she doesn't really love him, and starts to turn Linton against Cathy secretly. Heathcliff's plan is to get Linton to marry Cathy, telling him that if you marry her, you'll have all her property and you can control her and you can ruin her life. And Linton, because he's an idiot, goes along with this and eventually is able to trick Cathy into marrying him, and Cathy loses everything. Once she's married to Linton, she ends up trapped at Wuthering Heights, but she's only allowed to leave once, just once, to go see Edgar, who around this time has fallen ill and is dying, because again, it's Wuthering Heights and everyone will fall ill and die at some point. With her dad dead and now married to Linton, Cathy is forced to go back to Wuthering Heights, and Heathcliff, torments her saying, haha, I've ruined your life, Linton hates you, your life is going to be miserable now. And Cathy responds to this by saying she's not going to buy into Heathcliff's cycle of revenge, and she's going to try and do her best with Linton to make him love her in the end. Unfortunately for Cathy, this doesn't work out because Linton is a very sickly child and dies soon after. And again, like with Hindley, he's not necessarily outright murdered, but he's basically just left to die by Heathcliff. And so now we're basically back where we started the whole story at. We have Cathy Linton trapped at Wuthering Heights with Hareton and Heathcliff and Joseph, and Lockwood arrives, which was the start of the whole story. After hearing all this, Lockwood decides that this place is not for him, so he buggers off back to the city. But a few months later, he returns to Thrushcross Grange. He's in the neighbour on a visiting trip and decides to go see Nellie, but she's not at the Grange anymore. She's actually at Wuthering Heights, and so he goes up there and discovers that Heathcliff is now dead and Cathy and Hareton are to be married. In Nellie's narrative, Heathcliff's death seems to coincide with the blossoming romance of Cathy and Hareton, and Heathcliff's death seems to be linked to the ghost of Cathy and may or may not have been caused by Cathy's ghost, or maybe just Heathcliff's own insanity and guilt. And Cathy and Hareton are to shut up Wuthering Heights, leaving it with Joseph to basically rot together, and they are to move to the Grange where they will presumably have a happy ending until one of them, catches an illness and dies in the matter of moments. The story ends with Lockwood wondering where Catherine and Heathcliff are and wondering if their ghosts are still roaming the moors to this very day. Part 3, conclusion. Okay, so that's it for this summary of Wuthering Heights and summary of Emily Bronté's life. Next week, we're going to be looking at the narrators of the story, Nellie Dean and Lockwood especially, and working out how reliable their narrations are. But that's it for this video, so if you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to my channel for updates. I will post new Reader's Guide videos every Thursday, and I post my regular videos every Monday. Until next time.